My son Brandon sat there with a smug look, convinced he would get everything from his mother's multi-million-dollar empire. But when the lawyer read one single sentence from her last will, everything changed. That confident smile vanished from his face, replaced by a look of pure rage, and he began screaming so loudly that the walls of the office shook. To understand how we got to that point, you have to go back in time, back to a quiet afternoon in Charleston, South Carolina, just last week. The afternoon sun filtered through the window of my small workshop, illuminating the dust motes dancing in the golden light. I was sanding a mahogany table, a piece I'd spent months meticulously restoring. The smell of sawdust and varnish filled the air, a scent I've loved for over 65 years. It was a peaceful day, the kind of day that makes a man feel content with his simple life. That was when the phone rang, a shrill, jarring sound that felt out of place in my quiet workshop. An unfamiliar number appeared on the screen. "Mr. Jack Miller?" a professional voice asked. "This is Dan Carter from Carter and Associates in New York." My heart sank. No one from New York ever called me. "I'm calling on behalf of the estate of Mrs. Victoria Ann Kennedy," the lawyer continued, his voice crisp and professional, cutting through the silence of my workshop. "I regret to inform you that Mrs. Kennedy passed away last Tuesday. The reading of her will is scheduled for this Friday. You are named as a beneficiary, and your presence is required." My hand tightened around the phone receiver. Victoria Kennedy. I hadn't heard that full name spoken in over 15 years. The news was a physical blow, a wave of shock and grief that left me breathless. A beneficiary? I managed to say, the word feeling foreign on my tongue. What could she have left me? The lawyer's tone remained neutral. "The will is quite specific, Mr. Miller. We cannot disclose the contents until the reading. But your presence is mandatory." After hanging up, I sank into my worn armchair, the familiar scent of sawdust and fresh varnish suddenly too cloying. My mind drifted back, past the years of silence, past the bitterness of our divorce, to the very beginning. My first memory of her was in my workshop in Charleston, much like today, meticulously sanding a mahogany table. The year was 1987, and I was a young craftsman, full of dreams that were as simple and tangible as the wood in my hands. The bell above the shop door jingled, and in walked a woman with a fire in her eyes. It was Victoria Ann Kennedy. She was arguing fiercely with the shop owner about his refusal to hire a female manager. She was so full of passion, so magnificent in her conviction, that I was instantly captivated. That night, she left her business card, Victoria Kennedy, urban planner. It took me 3 days to muster the courage to call her. She laughed when I admitted I just wanted to take her to dinner. 6 months later, I proposed. My wedding gift to her wasn't a diamond, but a small, intricately carved wooden box. Inside, I placed a tiny wooden replica of the old clock tower in our neighborhood. "This is our world, Victoria," I whispered. "A world we can build together, one beautiful piece at a time." Her eyes, full of tears, promised me she believed it too. Our wedding day blazed with September sunshine, the kind of perfect weather that makes promises feel possible. Victoria wore her grandmother's dress, altered to fit her smaller frame, and carried wildflowers we'd picked that morning. My hands shook as I slipped the ring onto her finger. "Forever," she whispered, and I believed her completely. Brandon arrived 2 years later, a squalling, red-faced miracle who transformed our quiet house into something alive with purpose. I remember standing in the hospital room, watching Victoria cradle our son with the same fierce determination she brought to everything else. In that moment, with a hand-carved rocking horse I had made for Brandon sitting in the corner, I was certain that this perfect moment was all I'd ever need. But even then, holding that perfect baby, I noticed how Victoria's eyes occasionally drifted to the business magazine someone had left on the nightstand. As Brandon grew from a toddler to a schoolboy, I began to notice things I'd missed in those first blissful years. She bought Brandon a computer. Not a toy, but a real machine, worth more than my monthly salary. "He needs to understand technology," she explained, watching him navigate programs I'd never heard of. "The future belongs to kids who think digitally." I had suggested teaching him to whittle wood or fish instead. She'd laughed, but not kindly. We'd moved by then to a larger house, with a kitchen island bigger than our old apartment. Victoria's consulting firm had landed a contract with a national development consortium, and suddenly we had money for things I'd never imagined needing. A housekeeper came twice a week. Our refrigerator dispensed ice through the door, and Brandon's room looked like a toy store. "Isn't this wonderful?" Victoria asked one evening, gesturing at our new dining room. I missed our old kitchen table, scarred from years of Brandon's coloring projects and our late-night conversations. This new world, born of Victoria's ambition, was no longer the quiet, beautiful one we had promised to build together. The entertaining started almost immediately. Victoria hosted business associates, potential clients, and other successful couples whose conversations revolved around market share and investment strategies. I'd wear my best suit and try to contribute, but discussions about hedge funds and corporate restructuring left me feeling like I was speaking a foreign language badly. When someone would ask what I did, Victoria would offer an apologetic smile. "Jerry works at the power plant," she would say, and I heard something new in her voice. Not pride, but an apologetic edge, as if my job required an excuse. Brandon thrived in this new world. At 10, he could discuss computer programming with Victoria's tech-savvy clients. At 12, he was critiquing the wine choices at restaurants I couldn't afford on my own. At 14, he rolled his eyes when I suggested family camping trips, preferring Victoria's business conferences in Denver and Salt Lake City. "Dad doesn't understand" became his favorite phrase, usually delivered with the exasperated sigh of someone far too sophisticated for mundane concerns. The first real fight came on Brandon's 15th birthday. Victoria had planned a party that looked more like a corporate networking event, catered food, hired entertainment, a guest list full of business contacts and their children. I'd wanted something simpler, a barbecue in our backyard with his school friends. "This is embarrassing," I told her the night before. "He's 15, not 50. She adjusted an elaborate centerpiece with the same precision she brought to contract negotiations. "He's growing up in a different world than we did, Jack. These connections matter. They will shape his future." I thought about my own 15th birthday, fishing with my father, a homemade cake, presents wrapped in newspaper comics. It had been perfect in its simplicity. Victoria's party was a success by her standards. But I caught Brandon once, standing alone by the pool, looking lost among all the sophisticated celebration. "You okay, buddy?" I asked. He straightened quickly, slipping back into the persona Victoria had helped him craft. Of course. Why wouldn't I be? But for just a moment I'd seen the confused little boy underneath all that premature sophistication, and it broke my heart. That party marked the beginning of the end, though I didn't recognize it then. What followed were 10 years of slow-motion disaster, like watching a landslide from the bottom of the mountain. Inevitable, destructive, and impossible to stop. Victoria's real estate business consumed more of her time, more of her attention, more of her soul. Weekend family dinners became conference calls. Vacation plans got canceled for client emergencies. Brandon's school events competed with board meetings, and the meetings always won. "You don't understand the pressure I'm under," she'd say when I complained about missing another of Brandon's baseball games. "This business supports our lifestyle. Someone has to make the hard choices." But I understood pressure, the kind that came from keeping a power grid running, from making sure thousands of people had electricity when they flipped their switches. The difference was, my pressure served something larger than myself. By the time Brandon graduated high school, he'd become a stranger to me. Victoria had groomed him into her perfect protege, sharp, ambitious, dismissive of anything that didn't advance his prospects. When I suggested he consider trade school, along with college applications, he looked at me like I'd suggested he become a medieval serf. "Dad, that's exactly the kind of thinking that's holding you back," he said, 17 years old and already talking like a business consultant. "You settled for mediocrity. I won't make that mistake." The words hit like physical blows. The final explosion came during his senior year. When she missed Brandon's graduation because of a client crisis, I finally said what had been building for years. "This is enough, Victoria. Family has to come first sometimes." She stood in our new kitchen, that shrine to success, still wearing her business suit at midnight. "Don't you dare lecture me about priorities. Everything we have, everything Brandon's accomplished, exists because of my work." "What about everything we've lost?" I asked. "Like what?" She finally looked up from her phone, genuinely puzzled. "Like us. Like being a family instead of a corporation." She stared at me for a long moment, and I saw my answer in her eyes before she spoke. Maybe it's time we stop pretending this is working. The divorce took 6 months. Victoria's lawyers were efficient, professional, devastating. I got the house in Charleston, our old starter home that she'd kept as rental property, and enough money to live modestly. She got everything else, including Brandon's unquestioned loyalty. You're holding him back, too, Brandon told me during one of our last conversations. All this guilt about family values and simple living. It's toxic, Dad. I can't be around that negativity anymore. I sat alone in my empty house afterward, surrounded by boxes of memories from a life that apparently meant nothing to the people I'd loved most. The memories had faded, but the echoes of those final words lingered for 15 years, a silent presence in the quiet isolation of my life in Charleston. Now, here in my small apartment, the cold reality of Victoria's death began to settle over me like a heavy coat. The 3 days between Dan Carter's call and the funeral had passed in a strange, suspended state. I had cleaned my small workshop twice, polished a pair of leather shoes I hadn't worn in years, and rehearsed conversations that I knew would never happen. Each morning I'd considered not going, but a deeper, more primal part of me, the part that had once loved Victoria with all its heart, refused to be driven away from her final goodbye. The drive to New York was a journey not just in miles, but in worlds. I left behind the time-worn charm of Charleston, where history was etched into every brick, and entered the relentless, polished ambition of the city that had claimed Victoria. The chapel sat on a hill overlooking the metropolis, its Gothic architecture suggesting permanence and power. The air around the circular drive hummed with expensive engines, Mercedes sedans, BMW SUVs, a handful of Teslas that probably cost more than my entire life's savings. I parked my 15-year-old pickup truck between a Lexus and a Cadillac, feeling like a ghost from another time, an intruder at a celebration I was never meant to be a part of. Inside, the chapel whispered money. Mahogany pews, stained glass windows, flowers arranged with artistic precision. 200 pairs of eyes, belonging to strangers who had only known the successful Victoria, created a low hum of respectful mourning mixed with business networking. I slipped into a back pew, my goal to remain invisible, a shadow in a room full of light. But the whispers found me, a ripple of judgment in the still water of the crowd. I caught fragments of conversation. Her ex-husband. Can you believe he showed up after what he put her through? In this version of the story, I was the villain, the one who had anchored her down. Dad. The voice cut through the chapel's murmur like a blade. I looked up to see Brandon striding down the aisle, his face a mask of disbelief and barely controlled anger. He was a perfect reflection of Victoria's ambition, dressed in a suit that probably cost more than my monthly rent. What are you doing here? His voice carried, turning heads and silencing conversations. I stood slowly, meeting his gaze. I came to pay my respects. You lost the right to do that 15 years ago, he said. She wouldn't want you here. Maybe not, I replied, but I needed to be here. After all this time, do you think you have the right to do that? Brandon moved closer, close enough that I could smell his expensive cologne. She wouldn't want you here. You embarrassed her enough when she was alive. Don't compound it by pretending to grieve her death. I remained standing, holding his stare. Around us, the chapel buzzed with anticipation. Brandon then turned to address the gathered mourners, his voice carrying the practiced authority of someone accustomed to commanding rooms. I apologize for this disruption during what should be a time of remembrance. He gestured toward me with the casual dismissal of someone swatting a fly. My father seems to have forgotten that divorce means you're no longer family. A few people nodded. Someone whispered agreement. I felt heat rising in my cheeks, but forced myself to remain calm. For those who don't know, Brandon continued, warming to his theme, this is Jack Miller, the man who spent 22 years holding back one of the most brilliant women this city has ever produced. While my mother was building an empire that employed hundreds of people, he was content to punch a time clock and complain about her ambitions. The crowd was fully engaged now. I saw faces I recognized, former neighbors, people I'd considered friends during the marriage. None of them met my eyes. He took half her assets in the divorce, despite contributing nothing to her success. And now that she's gone, he shows up expecting sympathy, expecting to be treated like he mattered in her life. Each word landed like a physical blow, not because they were entirely untrue, but because they reduced 22 years of a complex marriage to a simple story of failure and blame. I thought about defending myself, explaining the complexity of what we'd shared, the love that had existed alongside the growing incompatibility. But what was the point? These people had chosen their narrative long ago. "Are you finished?" I asked quietly. My voice carried clearly through the silent chapel. "I loved your mother for 40 years. 22 of them as her husband, 18 more as someone who wished her well, despite everything that went wrong between us. I'm not here to demand recognition. I'm here because once upon a time we made promises to each other that mattered, and I choose to honor that memory." I sat back down. The funeral director, a young man with a strained smile, stepped forward to restore order. "The service will begin in 5 minutes," he announced. Brandon shot me one final look of contempt before striding toward the front pew reserved for family. I remained seated as the service went on, listening to the eulogies that painted Victoria as a visionary who'd overcome all obstacles to achieve greatness, with no room for the quiet craftsman who had once been her anchor. When it ended, people filed past, offering condolences to Brandon while pointedly ignoring me. Just as I was about to slip out, a man in an expensive suit approached me. "Mr. Miller," he said, extending his hand. "Dan Carter, I spoke with you on the phone. We need you and Brandon to come to my office for the reading of Mrs. Kennedy's will." The walk to Dan Carter's office took us 3 blocks through downtown New York, past buildings that had watched the city's fortunes rise and fall with the market. Dan maintained professional small talk, comments about the weather, the turnout at the service, carefully neutral observations that revealed nothing about what awaited us. Brandon walked beside me, his impatience barely concealed. "Just try not to make this more difficult than it needs to be," he muttered, not even looking at me. His office occupied the top floor of a restored brownstone, all dark wood and leather-bound books that spoke of established success. It was exactly the kind of place Victoria would have chosen. Prestigious but not ostentatious, successful but respectful of tradition. "Please have a seat," Dan gestured toward 2 leather chairs positioned in front of his mahogany desk. Brandon claimed the chair closest to Dan, leaving me the one slightly to the side, which felt appropriate given my peripheral status in these proceedings. Dan settled behind his desk and opened a thick file folder, extracting several legal documents with the careful precision of someone who'd performed this ritual countless times. The afternoon light slanted through tall windows, illuminating dust motes that danced like tiny spirits in the suddenly quiet room. Dan's voice carried the formal cadence of legal proceedings, each word carefully enunciated. Brandon leaned forward slightly, his hands clasped together, a man preparing to claim his birthright. "I hereby make the following specific bequests and devices," Dan read, his voice steady and clear. "To my beloved son, Brandon Kennedy, I leave the family home at 847 Hillcrest Avenue, along with all furnishings, artwork, and personal property contained therein. Additionally, I bequeath to Brandon the sum of $500,000 to be transferred from my primary investment account within 60 days of probate." Brandon smiled, a satisfied expression spreading across his face, but it was a smile that flickered with calculation. He was pleased, but I could see him calculating in his head. $500,000 was significant, but where was the company? "And now," Dan said, his voice dropping slightly, a clear signal that the most important part was yet to come. "I turn to the final disposition of Mrs. Kennedy's estate. To my former husband, Jack Miller," he read, his words falling into the quiet office like a bombshell. "I bequeath the sum of $49.5 million to be transferred from my primary investment accounts and securities portfolio. Additionally, I transfer to Jack Miller controlling interest in Kennedy Urban Development, including all subsidiary companies, real estate holdings, and business assets. This transfer includes 65% ownership of all corporate entities and an appointment as chairman of the board of directors." The words hung in the air like smoke from an explosion. I felt my mouth fall open, a physical reaction I couldn't control. Brandon's face had gone completely white, then flushed a violent red, as if his blood couldn't decide which direction to flow. "What did you just say?" he stammered, shooting to his feet so abruptly his chair rolled backward and struck the wall. "This is impossible! She wouldn't! She couldn't!" He turned to stare at me with an expression of pure disbelief mixed with something darker. "What did you do? How did you manipulate her?" I shrank back in my chair. "I didn't do anything," I said weakly. "I haven't spoken to your mother in 15 years. The word exploded from Brandon like a gunshot, People don't just give away $49.5 million to their ex-husbands for no reason. You must have gotten to her somehow. Convinced her when she was sick. He slammed his fist against Dan's desk, sending papers scattering across the room. "This is a fraud! A criminal fraud!" he screamed, his voice cracking with a mixture of rage and betrayal. She was manipulated. "Mr. Kennedy, I understand this is difficult news, but I must insist you control yourself," Dan said calmly, his voice cutting through the chaos with professional authority. "Your mother was neither sick nor vulnerable when she made these decisions. She was, in fact, more determined and clear-minded than I'd ever seen her." The will was executed with full legal authority. Brandon spun toward the lawyer, his eyes blazing. "Then why?" he demanded, his voice cracking with a mixture of rage and pain. "Why would she do this to me? I was everything she wanted me to be. I worked for her company. I lived the life she planned for me. I became the son she could be proud of." It was at that moment that a quiet voice from the doorway broke the tension. "Mrs. Kennedy," she was trying to protect her legacy. All eyes turned to Elena, the young architect who had been Victoria's personal confidant. Her face was pale, but her gaze was steady as she stepped into the room. She wasn't sick or manipulated. She was trying to fight one last battle, one she knew Brandon couldn't win. Brandon's fury shifted from me to Elena. "What are you talking about? My mother didn't need protection. She was a visionary. She knew about the hostile takeover," Elena said, her voice trembling but clear. "A powerful rival, one who would have destroyed everything she built. She saw how they would use your arrogance against you, Brandon. You were too easy to predict." The revelation hung in the air, a final, cold insult. I looked at Brandon, and for the first time, I saw him not as an entitled enemy, but as a man whose entire worldview had been shattered by the ultimate strategic move. He had built his life on the foundation of his mother's success, and now he was learning that she saw his confidence not as a strength, but as a fatal weakness. She knew she had to create a wild card, Elena continued, her voice gaining strength. Someone they would never see coming, someone with a different kind of strength, a strength built on integrity, not ambition. She told me she had to find someone who could find her old allies and fight this. Someone who could buy the company time. Elena looked directly at me. "She said she had to find you, Jack." I felt a surge of emotion, not triumph, but a profound, overwhelming sense of dread. Victoria hadn't left me a fortune. She had left me a battlefield. The will was not a prize for me, but a final, desperate gambit in a war she was no longer here to fight. The weight of Elena's words settled over the office like dust after an explosion. For several minutes, none of us spoke. Brandon's fury had been replaced by a stunned, hollow silence, his entire worldview shattered by the realization that his mother's empire was a battlefield she had been losing. I, on the other hand, felt a profound, overwhelming sense of dread. Victoria hadn't left me a fortune. She had left me a fight. The will was not a prize for me, but a final, desperate gambit in a war she was no longer here to fight. Dan finally broke the silence, his movements careful and deliberate. He gathered the will documents into a neat stack and reached for another envelope, one with personal message, written across it in Victoria's familiar, elegant handwriting. "Mrs. Kennedy left specific instructions regarding her decisions," he said, his voice gentle. "She asked me to share this message with you both." After the will was announced, Dan cleared his throat and began reading in Victoria's own words. "My dearest Jack," he read, and I felt my breath catch in my chest. Hearing her voice, filtered through the lawyer's professional cadence, was like a physical presence in the room. "If you're hearing this, it means I'm gone, and you're probably sitting in Dan's office, wondering if the entire world has lost its mind. I can picture your face, that expression you used to get when I'd rearranged the living room furniture without warning confused, but trying to be polite about it." A ghost of a smile touched my lips. She had captured that expression perfectly, and in that moment, the years of silence and bitterness dissolved. "I know this inheritance comes as a shock. I know you're probably thinking there's been some terrible mistake. But Jack, there isn't. The world of business is a battlefield, and I knew a rival was poised to destroy everything I built. Brandon, for all his ambition, was too predictable. He would have lost everything. I needed a wild card, a shock to the system, and I knew there was only one person with the quiet strength and unwavering integrity to fight for this company. I saw what you built in your workshop, Jack. not just with your hands, but with your character. I knew you would find my old allies and lead them. I knew you would be the anchor I needed in this final storm." She continued, her words becoming more personal. "I never stopped loving you, Jack. Not during our worst fights. Not during the divorce. I was angry at myself for choosing ambition over the life we could have had. This is my last confession, my final act of love. I'm giving you a purpose worthy of your character, a mission to prove that integrity can triumph over ruthless ambition." "However," Dan continued, his voice softening, "the will contains a message for Brandon as well." Brandon's head snapped up, his rage momentarily displaced by a desperate curiosity. He was about to hear his mother's final words to him, words he had waited his whole life to hear. Dan began reading again, his tone shifting to a more solemn cadence. "Brandon, my beautiful, brilliant boy, I know you're furious right now. I know you probably feel I've betrayed you. But, sweetheart, you're not ready for this inheritance. Not yet." Brandon's face went white, then flushed a violent red, cycling through emotions too quickly to track. "You've lived your entire adult life in the shadow of my success, accepting the benefits without understanding the true responsibility. You've never had to build something from nothing, never had to make the hard choices that true wealth requires." "That's not true," Brandon whispered, his voice cracking with a raw, broken sound. Dan continued, ignoring the outburst. "I'm giving you a chance to discover who you are when you're not living in the shadow of unlimited wealth. Learn to build something yourself. Learn to value people over profit. And learn to forgive your father for the crime of being human and imperfect." The words hit Brandon like a physical blow. He made a sound like a wounded animal, a guttural mix of rage and pain. This wasn't a lecture. It was a final, cold assessment from the person whose approval he had spent his life chasing. "Jack, you're inheriting more than money." Dan read on, the letter's focus returning to me. "You're inheriting the chance to do what I should have done, use wealth as a tool for good rather than a weapon for proving superiority. I trust you because you never wanted this, because you'll never use it to hurt people the way I sometimes did." The message continued for several more paragraphs, outlining practical arrangements and expressing hopes for both our futures. But the core message was clear. Victoria had chosen a new path, a final, desperate gambit that required her to trust a man of integrity over a man of ambition. When Dan finished reading, the office fell into a profound silence. I sat with tears on my cheeks, overwhelmed by the gift of knowing that Victoria had loved me until the end. Brandon, however, stared at the floor, his entire worldview crumbling around him. Finally, he rose slowly, a ghost of the confident man who had entered. "This isn't over," he said quietly, but the fire had gone out of his voice. He left without another word, the door closing behind him with a soft click that seemed to echo in the sudden quiet. I sat there, holding the last conversation I would ever have with the woman who had shaped my life. The silence in the office was a heavy blanket after Brandon left. Dan began organizing papers on his desk, his movements bringing us back to reality. There will be paperwork to complete, accounts to transfer, board meetings to schedule. The company's current management team is excellent. They can help you transition into your new role. I nodded, still processing the magnitude of what had happened. I had come to New York to pay my respects, and I was leaving as the head of an empire. "Dan," I asked quietly, "did she really love me, even after everything went wrong?" He smiled, the first genuine smile I'd seen from him all day. "Jack, she talked about you every time we met. Not about the divorce, not about the problems, but about the man who taught her that success without character is just an expensive failure." It was, I believe, her way of making things right in the eyes of God. A week later, I was back in my quiet workshop in Charleston, surrounded by the familiar scent of sawdust. The world outside had changed, but my world inside remained the same. Just as I was about to begin work, the bell on the door jingled. It was Brandon. He didn't have his usual smug confidence. His shoulders were slumped, his eyes were red. He came and sat silently on a stool. "I read her letter again, Dad," he said, his voice barely a whisper. "I read it over and over. I was so angry, but I realized she was right. I don't know how to lead with integrity. She gave me a gift, a chance to start over. She told me to listen to you, to the man who truly understood what it meant to build something of value. I think maybe this was God's plan for us, a way to mend our broken family story." I looked at my son not with pity but with a profound sense of hope. The son I had lost was finally starting to come home. We didn't talk about money or business. We talked about her, about our family story, and about what she had really left us. Victoria had seen that the greatest gift she could give was not a fortune to inherit, but a purpose to live for. We decided to use her company for a greater good, to build communities with integrity, and to preserve history in Charleston. The final lesson of this complicated family story is that justice isn't about revenge or vindication, but about recognition, the recognition that character matters more than credentials, that patience outlasts entitlement, and that love, real love, is a God-given purpose that never truly dies. The conclusion of this story is just the beginning of a meaningful journey. Jack proved that integrity and character are more important than fame and fortune. In your opinion, what is the most valuable lesson we can learn from this family story? Share your thoughts below and join the conversation. If you want to hear more inspiring stories, subscribe to our channel and help us spread these positive values together. Thank you for listening.